Hello, fellow birders. My name is Dennis Kania. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at small flycatchers that show up in the early spring migration. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird-related. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be talking about small flycatchers that show up in the early spring migration. And those would include least flycatcher, eastern wood pewee, and eastern Phoebe. These charts represent data that has been collected at Fermilab over the past 33 years. And so for least flycatcher, you can see that their migration starts to show up in our area around the beginning of May. And very seldom does it slip into the last part of April. And these birds will be with us through May, and usually by mid-June, we're not getting any records anymore. Historically, we did have some, but it seems like that trend has changed over the last 10 years. Eastern wood pewee also starts to show up in migration in the first week of May. And since it's a breeding species, we'll have them with us all through the breeding season and through the end of September, with some records appearing in October, but by then they're gone. Eastern Phoebe, on the other hand, seems to get a really early start on migration compared to the previous two species. And we actually have records going back into mid-March. So they basically have a 6 to 7 week head start on those other two species. And again, they're with us through the breeding season, and we start to lose them by the end of October, but we still get records in November, and we've even had some records in December on the Christmas count. So let's start with least flycatcher, which is one of those Apidnax flycatchers. We have 5 Apidnax flycatchers that do appear in DuPage County. And least flycatcher is typically the first one to be encountered in the spring. These species are, for the most part, reliable as far as identification only with song. So we're going to go out on a limb a little bit here and talk about some visual features as well. All 5 of the Apidnax flycatchers do have eye rings that are pretty substantial for the most part, and 2 strong wing bars. With this particular bird that I have shown, we might hazard a guess that its ID is least flycatcher, and that's based on a couple of things that we might be able to get away with here. The first one being the eye ring. If we take a look at this eye ring, you can follow my cursor, you can see that it's very bold behind the eye and somewhat so in front of the eye, and it thins out quite a bit above and below the eye. And that's a feature that we typically see in the eye rings of least flycatchers. Another thing that we might want to look at is, if I go over to this other image, you can see that there's a line here where all the secondary feathers end. All the secondary feathers are pretty much the same length, and so they do form kind of a line. And then if we go out further to where the primaries end, the furthest out, the longest primary ends out here. So the distance between where the secondaries end and the primaries end, that's called primary projection. And for a bird like the least flycatcher, typically that primary projection is short, and we'll be comparing that later to eastern pewee, and you'll see that it has a much longer primary projection. So for now, let's consider this bird to be a least flycatcher, and that would in fact be the species of Apidnax flycatcher we'd first encounter in the spring. So here we have eastern wood pewee, and it's going to differ from all of the Apidnax flycatchers by the lack of that complete eye ring. You might see some markings around the eye, but it certainly is not an eye ring. And you can see that the wing bars on this bird are prominent enough that they'll show up in the field, but they're not really as strong as what we would see on some of those Apidnax flycatchers. You'll notice that the tail is very long compared to the rest of the bird. So that certainly is longer than anything we would see on any of our Apidnax flycatchers. And once again, if we look at the line that's created by the ends of all the secondaries, and I'm showing that right now with my cursor, and then if we go out to the longest primary, being all the way out here, now look at that distance between those 2 points, the secondary end and the primary end, and that's our primary projection again. You can see that's quite a bit longer than what we were looking at on the least flycatcher. So those are all several features that would help us to separate the eastern wood pewee from any of the Epidnex flycatchers, and in particular the least flycatcher that we're going to encounter in early spring. Pewees in general tend to look longer and sleeker than the Epidnex flycatchers, and part of that is due to the fact that it does have this very long tail, it does have this long primary projection, and those two features help kind of elongate the bird and make it look like it's a sleeker looking bird than what we would see in the least flycatcher. Our third species under consideration is the eastern Phoebe. And we see right away that this bird does not have any kind of an eye-ring at all. So quickly we can decide that this is not a pewee. It's not an Epidnex flycatcher. You may see some very diffused wing bars, but for the most part, we would not say that this bird has wing bars. They're just very, very weak and sometimes almost non-existent. If we look at this other bird here, you can see there's really nothing going on in the way of wing bars. And again, no eye ring. So those are two main features that we would look at and say, oh, well, we're looking at a eastern Phoebe. Other things to consider are the fact that the head is typically darker than the back color. So we do see a bit of contrast here between those two areas. And the bill is always going to be black on an eastern Phoebe in the springtime. And if we were to look back at the bills of the eastern wood pewee and the least flycatcher, we'd see that the lower mandible would have some pink or orangish color to the base of it. So there are several things that we consider here that will help us visually separate the eastern Phoebe from all the other two species. One additional thing that I need to mention is that this bird does like to bob its tail a lot. And so if you do have a flycatcher bobbing his tail, you can start to look down the path and look for other characteristics that will confirm the fact that it's eastern Phoebe. They don't always bob their tail, so you can't rely on that. So in the simplest of terms, all Epidnex flycatchers will show a complete eye ring and of varying in strength, and they'll have two well-defined wing bars. Eastern wood pewees will lack that eye ring, and it'll still have two wing bars, but they're not as bold as what we typically see on most of our Epidnex flycatchers, and in particular the least flycatcher. Eastern Phoebe will lack the eye ring. It'll also lack the wing bars that we see on the other two species. So you can kind of see a cascading effect here of losing certain features until we get all the way down to the Phoebe, which is lacking both the eye ring and the wing bars. There are some supporting characteristics that I mentioned earlier that should also be looked for to solidify your identifications, but this is enough to get you well on your way. So thanks for taking time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope that you'll join us again for future videos as we explore all things bird related.